Hi, my name's Kira. I am a speech and language therapist, and this is training for teaching staff of primary and secondary schools about how to support children who stammer. So, this will take maximum an hour, and we will be learning about what stammering is, why it happens, and what we can do to support children who do stammer. So, learning a little bit about stammering to begin with, which can also be called stuttering or disfluency. Stammering tends to be the British name, stuttering tends to be American, but it's all the same. Um, it usually begins between 2 and 4 years of age. It's very rare that I would have a 10-year-old come to me who suddenly started stammering, who has never stammered before. So it does usually start in the early years as language develops. It occurs in all cultures and social backgrounds. And in the early years, a similar number of boys and girls start to stammer, but girls tend to recover from stammering more naturally. And we're not sure why that is, but the ratio seems to be about 5 to 1 boys to girls. So I do see a lot more boys in my clinics than girls. We know that about 5% of the population have stammered at some point in their lives, and about 1% of the population stammer at any given time. We do also know that the vast majority of children who stammer go on to naturally regain their fluency and will not stammer as adults. Stammering is known as a neurodevelopmental difficulty, and all this means is that it's to do with the way the brain develops. And that's why we tend to see stammering begin when children are having their language development boost in the early years. It's because as their brain is growing, that's when we begin to notice stammering. Stammering is a very complex thing. There are many different factors that influence and affect stammering, and we'll talk about them in a little minute. And stammering can be really inconsistent and variable, which can be really frustrating for parents and teachers because it can be really difficult to pinpoint when stammering happens and what is affecting it. And stammers, they do go up and down in nature, especially for children whose language skills are still developing. It's very normal that the stammer will seem to come and go, and it's hard to put our fingers on why that is. So there are three main things that might happen for children who go through periods of stammering. Some of these children will naturally regain their fluency, perhaps with very little help. Some of these children will need a little bit of support to manage their stammers or regain their fluency. And a very small percentage of children who stammer will go on to stammer for their whole lives. So what is stammering or stuttering or disfluency? This can be really useful to know as teachers because it might help you when you're thinking about referring a child in for support with stammering. So when we talk about stammering, really what we're talking about is repetition of single syllable whole words and, I, like, something like that. Also repetitions of sounds or syllables. So I like chocolate. Prolongation of sounds, so stretching them. So I'm going to see my mum soon, or blocking. And that's where the child goes to talk, but there is so much tension that no noise comes out. So maybe a bit like that. So those are the core features of stammering. And when I tend to meet the children who stammer, they may show predominantly one type of those stammers or a bit of a mix of all of them. These features of stammering may be accompanied by physical tension and struggle. So some children who stammer become so tense that you might notice some physical features like facial tension or distraction techniques like looking away. And some of those little tricks that children initially use to get around the stammer, they sometimes become part of the stammer. You might notice them when you see the child talk. Other things you might notice are safety behaviours, such as avoidance of words and situations. So some children who stammer become master maskers. So they become experts at hiding their stammer. So much so that you might not hear a lot of stammering, but you might notice that they are avoiding a lot of talking situations. So, for example, yesterday I met an 8-year-old girl who essentially spends most of her talking time getting around the moment of stammering by switching words. So when I said, do you have brothers or sisters? She said, yes, I've got some siblings, because she got stuck on the word sister. So that is also part of stammering. Young children's speech may also show very normal or typical disfluencies that we don't count as stammering, because they are typical processes that children have when they are developing their language skills. So hesitations and interjections. You might hear little children say things like, we went to the shops yesterday. And that's often to do with them processing what they want to say. Revisions. So I really love cats. And revisions are tricky because they are very typical disfluencies, but it's hard to tell the difference between a revision and a child who is purposefully changing what they are saying to avoid a moment of stammering. And then multisyllabic word repetition, because, and phrase repetition. I like cats. Those disfluencies are very typical in young children, but actually, even as adults, we do a lot of those things, particularly when we're under pressure. So if you ever listen to someone doing a speech, you may notice a lot of those typical disfluencies, and that's just because the processing pressure is up. So if you're thinking about referring a child in who stutters, it would be really helpful if you can comment on the type of stuttering you're seeing, because certain types of stuttering are higher risk than others. So for example, if I meet a young child who, or even a teenager who is repeating sounds like that, that might be a little bit less concerning than when I meet a young person who is having a lot of blocking and tension. And that's because when we see a lot of tension and blocking, that tells me that the child is probably aware of their stammer and maybe starting to fight against it. So stammering is a complex thing. I have crossed out the word problem because stammering in itself isn't a problem, it's just a way of talking. Stammering is very complex, and here are some of the things that might affect the severity of the stammer. And when I say severity of the stammer, I mean how often it's happening and the type of stammer. So some of these factors that influence the amount of stammering you hear are things like physiological factors. So we know that stammering is genetic. There is a genetic component. So if I meet a child, I will always ask, is there any family history of stammering? And if there is, that gives me a clue that this child has been born with a predisposition towards stammering and may need a little bit more support than a child where there's no family history of stammering. Sex plays a factor because we know that boys are more likely to stammer than girls, and also things like tiredness and health. Um, Talking takes a huge amount of brain energy. So when we're tired or if we're unwell, that will affect how efficient our talking is. And you may notice that children stammer more when they are unwell or tired. Speech motor factors also influence things. So children who have speech coordination difficulties, such as dyspraxia of speech, are more likely to stammer just because they are already having to work harder to talk. The types of stammer can influence the severity. So we spoke about how blocking could be deemed a higher risk stammer than repetitions, and speech rate. So many teachers and parents say to me, the child stammers more when they speak quickly. And that makes sense because we always speak more efficiently when we go a bit slower. Language and communication skills influence stammering. So it's a double-edged sword, really. Children with very advanced language skills are more likely to stammer, but also children whose language skills are behind their peers. So really, if the scale is tipped either way, we may see more stammering. In terms of children who've got very advanced language skills, well, really, either way, this is to do with the mismatch between the child's language skills and the rest of their cognitive level. So, for example, if I meet a 4-year-old and they are speaking at the level of a 7-year-old, they're really speaking outside of their natural comfort zone of language skill, and they're adding more cognitive pressure on themselves, which may lead to stammering. But children whose language skills are a little bit behind the rest of their skills will be struggling to express themselves as clearly as they want to. And that again may lead to stammering. Speech sound difficulties. So some children have amazing sentences, but some of their speech sounds are hard to understand. That mismatch sort of adds more talking pressure and can lead to stammering. And we also know that children with social communication are more likely to stammer. So children with a diagnosis of autism or ADHD are more likely to have a stammer than children without. And that's just because there's kind of comorbidities between different neurodevelopmental difficulties. Stammering is a neurodevelopmental difficulty, and ADHD and autism are also neurodevelopmental disorders. Psychological factors influence our talking. So we actually know now that anxiety does not cause stammering. So people with diagnosed anxiety disorders aren't more likely to stammer. What tends to happen is children who stammer go on to become more anxious than their peers who don't stammer. However, we do know that children who are a little bit less confident and the more sensitive children who stammer are more likely to go on to stammer in the long run, as opposed to children who stammer who are naturally more robust and resilient. So if I meet a child in clinic who has a stammer, but is still a really confident and keen talker with little awareness or worry about their stammer, I will be much less worried about how they're going to get on than if I meet a child who's a little bit more nervous and sensitive about their talking. And we know that reactions to stammering can have a huge effect on what happens to the stammer. And we'll talk about that a bit more later. Lastly, environmental factors. So the pace of life, if a child is feeling very rushed and busy, that will affect their talking. Turn taking in the family, so lots of people are talking all at once, or if they are finding school and nursery particularly hard, that can have an impact on their talking. And really, the way we look at all these factors is a bit like a set of scales. So on one side is the child's speech and language skill, and on the other are all these factors. As soon as the scales are tipped, so the pressure is above their skill set, we may see stammering. Children who are born with a predisposition to stammering already have the scales tipped towards stammering. Children who have speech and language difficulties, their scales are also already tipped towards stammering because their speech and language skills are down here. So naturally they can cope with less pressure. And our job really as adults who support these children to help figure out which factors are tipping the scales so that then we know how to support them. As well as this, talking is the most complex thing that our brains ever do. And when we talk, we use lots and lots of different parts of the brain. So it's really important that these parts of the brain work together really efficiently. These parts of the brain are joined together by pathways, and we can think of these pathways like roads. Some of these pathways or roads are like motorways. They are really efficient and fast and they work really well. But some of the connections are like country roads. So they're a bit windier and things take a little bit longer. When a child is calm, relaxed in a familiar environment, there is very little traffic on these roads or connections when they're talking. But all of these different factors may cause traffic for that child and mean that the connections between their talking parts of their brain don't work as efficiently. So really our job is to help reduce the traffic for that child so that talking can be as easy and fun as possible.